I stand outside these mahogany doors, hearing muffled voices plotting inside the boardroom of Sullivan Industries. My trembling fingers clutch legal documents proving my 65% majority ownership. 6 months ago, they celebrated throwing me out of the company my father built from absolutely nothing. Uncle Robert, Janet Walsh, Harold Cooper. They all thought I was just Daddy's spoiled little princess who would crumble and vanish into obscurity. But while they congratulated themselves and toasted their victory, I was quietly purchasing every available share through carefully constructed shell companies. Now I'm about to walk through these doors and reclaim everything that rightfully belongs to me and my father's memory. 6 months earlier, I was Kristen Sullivan, Vice President of Operations at Sullivan Industries, the precision automotive parts manufacturing company my father Thomas had built from his garage 32 years ago. Dad started with just a welding torch and a dream, working 18-hour days to land his first contract with a local car dealership. By the time I graduated from Northwestern with my business degree, Sullivan Industries employed 400 people across 2 facilities and supplied components to major automotive manufacturers throughout the Midwest. Dad's sudden heart attack at 58 shattered my world completely. One morning, he was reviewing production schedules with me over coffee, and by evening I was signing papers at the hospital, watching machines keep him alive until his body finally surrendered. The funeral brought hundreds of employees, suppliers, and clients who spoke about his integrity, his handshake deals, and how he treated everyone from janitors to executives with genuine respect. During those first grief-stricken weeks, the board members surrounded me with what seemed like protective support. Uncle Robert, Dad's younger brother who served as our legal counsel, handled estate matters while repeatedly assuring me that everything would continue smoothly. Janet Walsh, our chief financial officer for 8 years, took over daily financial operations and promised to guide me through the transition. Harold Cooper, Dad's college roommate and longtime family friend, who managed our largest client relationships, stepped up to maintain those crucial connections. "Your father prepared you well," Uncle Robert told me during one of our evening meetings in Dad's former office. "But grief can cloud judgment, sweetheart. Let us handle the heavy lifting while you process this loss." I trusted them completely. These people had been fixtures at family barbecues, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings. They knew Dad's vision for the company and seemed committed to preserving his legacy while protecting me from overwhelming responsibilities during my mourning period. But 3 weeks after the funeral, I discovered irregularities in our quarterly financial reports. Expense categories showed unusual spikes without corresponding documentation. Vendor payments appeared inflated compared to previous years. Client billing cycles seemed inconsistent with established patterns. When I approached Janet about these discrepancies, she dismissed my concerns with patronizing explanations about seasonal fluctuations and market adjustments. "Kristen, honey, you're still learning these systems," she said, barely looking up from her computer screen. "Your father handled strategic oversight while I managed operational details. Trust me to continue that arrangement." Her condescending tone triggered something protective in me. Dad had spent years teaching me every aspect of this business. From production line efficiency to profit margin calculations, he believed in my capabilities and had been grooming me to eventually take full leadership. These weren't rookie mistakes or emotional overreactions. These were legitimate concerns about financial irregularities that demanded investigation. My attempts to dig deeper met increasing resistance from all 3 board members. They scheduled meetings without including me, claiming they were handling administrative details that didn't require my input. They redirected my questions about specific expenditures and suggested I focus on healing and processing instead of worrying about business operations. The breaking point came during a private meeting I requested with Uncle Robert in his downtown law office. I brought printed evidence of the financial inconsistencies and asked for his honest assessment of what I'd discovered. He leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, completely devoid of familial warmth. "Kristen, I'm going to be direct with you because it's time you understood reality. Your father spoiled you terribly. He filled your head with fantasies about running this company. But business requires hard decisions and strategic thinking that you simply don't possess. The words hit me like physical blows. This was my uncle, who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had attended every school graduation, who had hugged me at Dad's funeral and promised to protect our family legacy. You're grieving and confused, he continued, his voice growing sharper. These financial irregularities you think you've found are normal business operations that you lack the experience to understand. Janet and Harold have been planning your transition away from daily operations for weeks now. We're doing this for your own good. I stared at him, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. My transition away from operations? This is my father's company. I'm his heir and primary beneficiary. Uncle Robert's laugh was bitter and dismissive. You're a 28-year-old with a business degree and no real-world experience outside of what your father handed you. This company needs actual leadership, not emotional decision-making based on grief and inexperience. The realization crashed over me like ice water. This wasn't protective guidance or temporary support during my mourning period. This was a coordinated effort to remove me from the company my father had built, using my grief and trust as weapons against me. We've scheduled a board meeting for next Thursday, Uncle Robert said, straightening papers on his desk with deliberate dismissal. We'll be voting on some structural changes that will benefit everyone involved. I walked out of his office in a daze, understanding for the first time that my own family had orchestrated my downfall before Dad's body was even cold in the ground. The following Thursday morning, I arrived at Sullivan Industries' main conference room expecting a discussion about company direction and my evolving role within the organization. Instead, I walked into a perfectly orchestrated ambush designed to destroy my reputation and remove me permanently from the business Dad had built with his own hands. The polished mahogany table reflected the stern faces of people I had considered family friends just months earlier. Uncle Robert sat at the head position, shuffling through a thick stack of documents with the methodical precision of a prosecutor preparing for trial. Janet Walsh wore a dark navy suit that made her appear more authoritative than I'd ever seen her. Harold Cooper avoided my eyes entirely, staring at his folded hands with obvious discomfort. Thank you for coming, Kristen, Uncle Robert began formally. We've called this meeting to address serious concerns about financial mismanagement and operational decision-making that require immediate board action. I felt confusion wash over me. Financial mismanagement? I had discovered irregularities and brought them to their attention. How had my investigation transformed into accusations against me? Janet Walsh stood up, her expression cold and professional. Over the past several weeks, I've uncovered evidence of significant financial irregularities that appear to stem from decisions made since Thomas's passing. These irregularities involve unauthorized expenditures, questionable vendor relationships, and concerning patterns of financial behavior. She began distributing manila folders to each board member, including one for me. Inside were photocopied bank statements, expense reports, and approval signatures that made my blood freeze in my veins. According to these documents, I had authorized payments for personal luxury purchases, using company accounts, designer clothing, expensive jewelry, a weekend trip to Napa Valley that I had never taken. These bank statements show repeated personal use of company funds, Janet continued, her voice growing stronger with each accusation. Luxury purchases totaling over $40,000 in just 6 weeks, all bearing Kristen's authorization signatures. I stared at the documents, recognizing my signature on each approval form while knowing absolutely that I had never seen these expenditures before this moment. The signatures looked authentic, but I had never authorized payments for a $3,000 handbag or a weekend spa retreat in California. These signatures are forged, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I never approved any of these purchases. I've never even been to Napa Valley. Uncle Robert's expression remained unmoved. Kristen, we understand you're going through a difficult period, but denying clear documentary evidence isn't helping your situation. Harold Cooper finally spoke, his voice heavy with what seemed like genuine regret. I've observed some concerning behavioral changes since Thomas's death, emotional outbursts during client meetings, erratic decision-making, and what appears to be increasingly poor judgment about appropriate business conduct. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Harold had been at our family dinner table countless times, sharing stories and laughter with Dad and me. Now he was testifying against my character with the same mouth that had offered condolences at the funeral. I've documented several instances where client relationships have been strained due to inappropriate comments or emotional responses. Harold continued, reading from prepared notes. Our largest contractor, Morrison Parts, has expressed concerns about continued business relationships given recent interactions. Morrison Parts. The name triggered a memory of Dad mentioning competition and pricing pressures from that company, but Harold was presenting their concerns as evidence of my incompetence rather than normal market dynamics. Janet Walsh resumed her presentation, producing additional documents that painted an increasingly damaging picture. Purchase orders I had supposedly approved for unnecessary equipment, vendor contracts with inflated pricing that bore my signature, personnel decisions that had allegedly created employee morale problems. Each piece of evidence felt meticulously crafted to demonstrate my incompetence and untrustworthiness. The signatures looked authentic enough to fool anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with my handwriting patterns. The expenditures aligned with stereotypes about spoiled young women inheriting family businesses and immediately making irresponsible decisions. Given this evidence, Uncle Robert announced formally, I move that we remove Kristen Sullivan from her position as Vice President of Operations and suspend her voting rights as a shareholder, pending a full financial audit. The motion was seconded by Janet Walsh immediately. Harold Cooper nodded his agreement after a moment of apparent hesitation. I cast the only opposing vote, my single voice echoing futilely in the conference room. Motion carries, 4 votes to 1, Uncle Robert declared with finality. Kristen, we'll need you to surrender your access cards, office keys, and any company property in your possession. Security guards appeared at the conference room door, as if they had been waiting outside for this exact moment. They escorted me to my office while other employees watched with confusion and whispered speculation. My personal belongings were hastily thrown into cardboard boxes, framed photos of Dad and me at company events, my college diploma, a coffee mug he had given me that read Future CEO. The walk through the production floor toward the exit felt like a funeral march. These were people who had known me since childhood, who had watched me grow up visiting the factory with Dad, who had celebrated when I joined the company after graduation. Now they watched in stunned silence as security marched me out like a criminal. Local news crews had somehow been alerted to the story. Cameras captured my humiliation as I loaded boxes into my car, while reporters shouted questions about financial misconduct and family business disputes. The evening news featured segments about local heiress ousted for financial mismanagement, with footage of my red-faced, tearful departure from Sullivan Industries. Sitting in my car in the parking lot, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing the remnants of my professional life, I understood the full scope of their planning. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to discovered irregularities. This was a calculated character assassination designed to ensure I could never return or challenge their authority. They had destroyed my reputation so thoroughly that even attempting to fight back would seem like the desperate actions of a disgraced former executive trying to blame others for her own failures. The weeks following my public humiliation passed in a blur of isolation and mounting despair. Former friends stopped returning my phone calls, clearly uncomfortable with associating with someone accused of embezzling family business funds. Professional contacts who had known Dad for decades suddenly became unavailable when I reached out for support or guidance. The tight-knit business community that had embraced me as Thomas Sullivan's daughter now treated me like a pariah carrying some contagious professional disease. My personal finances crumbled under the weight of legal fees as I attempted to challenge the forged documents and false accusations. The family attorney who had handled Dad's estate suddenly declared a conflict of interest and referred me to other lawyers who charged consultation fees I could barely afford. My personal bank accounts were frozen pending the financial audit Uncle Robert had demanded, leaving me dependent on credit cards and the small emergency fund Dad had always insisted I maintain. I moved from the family home where I'd lived since Dad's death into a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of town. The space felt claustrophobic after growing up in Dad's spacious house, but it was all I could afford while fighting to clear my name. Every morning I woke up surrounded by cardboard boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack, staring at Dad's framed photograph, and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The lowest moment came during a sleepless night 3 weeks after my termination, when I found myself sitting on the apartment floor surrounded by financial documents, crying over Dad's picture. I had spent years learning this business, understanding every detail of operations, building relationships with employees and clients. Dad had trusted me with his life's work, and I had failed to protect it from the people closest to our family. But something shifted in that moment of complete despair. Maybe it was Dad's voice in my memory, reminding me that Sullivan Industries was built on determination and refusing to quit when things got difficult. Maybe it was anger finally overtaking grief and shock. Or maybe it was simply the realization that accepting defeat meant letting Uncle Robert and Janet Walsh profit from their betrayal, while Dad's legacy crumbled. I decided to fight back, but not through emotional confrontations or public accusations that would be dismissed as desperate blame-shifting. Instead, I would investigate the financial irregularities I had originally discovered and build an airtight case proving their deception. Using almost the last of my available funds, I hired Danny Rodriguez, a private investigator recommended by one of the few attorneys who would still meet with me. Danny was a former police detective who specialized in corporate fraud cases, and his initial consultation gave me the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in weeks. "These signatures look authentic at first glance," he said, examining the forged documents Janet had presented, "but the pressure patterns and letter spacing suggest someone practiced your signature extensively before creating these forgeries. Professional document examiners can prove these are fakes if we can establish the right timeline and evidence." Danny's investigation began with the financial records Dad had kept in his home office, documents that Uncle Robert hadn't been able to access or destroy because they were stored in Dad's personal safe. These records revealed patterns of payments and vendor relationships that contradicted the narrative Janet had constructed about my supposed mismanagement. More importantly, Danny discovered that Janet Walsh had been living far beyond what her chief financial officer salary should have supported. She drove a luxury BMW that cost more than her annual income, wore designer clothing to work that totaled thousands of dollars, and had recently purchased a vacation home in Florida despite claiming modest investment returns on her personnel files. People don't usually hide financial success unless that success came from questionable sources, Danny explained. Your CFO is living like someone with significant unreported income, which suggests she's been skimming funds for longer than anyone realized. His surveillance revealed even more damaging information. Janet had been meeting regularly with executives from Morrison Manufacturing, the competitor Harold Cooper had mentioned during my board meeting. These weren't casual social encounters, they were deliberately secretive meetings at restaurants outside of town, often involving the exchange of documents and what appeared to be substantial cash payments. The breakthrough came when Danny managed to photograph Janet, leaving one of these meetings with a manila envelope that she immediately locked in her car's glove compartment. Following up with financial records requests, we discovered that Morrison Manufacturing had been awarded several contracts that previously belonged to Sullivan Industries, with bidding information that suggested inside knowledge of our pricing strategies and client relationships. "She's not just embezzling company funds," Danny told me during our meeting at a coffee shop downtown. "She's selling your trade secrets and client information to your biggest competitor. That's corporate espionage on top of fraud and forgery." The scope of their betrayal was even deeper than I had imagined. Janet Walsh hadn't just orchestrated my removal to cover her embezzlement. She had been systematically undermining Sullivan Industries for months, possibly years, by selling confidential information to Morrison Manufacturing while using forged documents to frame me for her crimes. I realized that my investigation had uncovered evidence of federal crimes that went far beyond family business disputes. This was criminal conspiracy involving theft of trade secrets, mail fraud, and corporate espionage that fell under FBI jurisdiction. That evening, I made my first anonymous tip to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, providing Danny's photographs and financial evidence of Janet's meetings with Morrison Manufacturing executives. I also began developing a strategic plan that would allow me to expose their crimes while simultaneously reclaiming control of Dad's company. If they wanted to play hardball with forged documents and character assassination, I would respond with legal precision and strategic planning that would leave them no escape routes. My counterattack began not with confrontation or public accusations, but with the quiet, methodical acquisition of Sullivan Industries stock through a network of carefully constructed shell companies. While Uncle Robert, Janet Walsh, and Harold Cooper believed they had permanently neutralized me, I was using every available resource to purchase shares from smaller investors who had grown nervous about the company's stability following my public removal. Working with Margaret Chen, a corporate attorney who specialized in securities law and mergers, I established 3 separate limited liability companies with innocuous names like Midwest Manufacturing Holdings and Great Lakes Investment Partners. These entities existed solely to purchase Sullivan Industries stock, without revealing my involvement or triggering the disclosure requirements that would alert the board to my activities. The initial capital came from Dad's life insurance policy, which had made me the beneficiary of $500,000 that Uncle Robert couldn't touch through the estate proceedings. I liquidated my personal investment accounts, sold the jewelry Dad had given me for birthdays and graduations, and borrowed against my car to maximize available funding for stock purchases. Margaret helped me navigate the complex regulations governing share acquisitions, ensuring that each purchase stayed below the 5% threshold that would require public disclosure of ownership changes. By spreading acquisitions across multiple shell companies and timing purchases strategically, we could accumulate significant holdings while maintaining complete secrecy about my involvement. The key is patience and precision, Margaret explained during one of our weekly strategy meetings. Your uncle and his allies are overconfident because they believe you're defeated and irrelevant. That overconfidence is your greatest advantage. My research revealed that Sullivan Industries had originally been incorporated with 10,000 shares, of which Dad had retained 70% ownership while distributing the remaining 30% among early investors and key employees. Following Dad's death, I had inherited his shares, but the board's removal of my voting rights meant I couldn't exercise control despite technically owning the largest single block. However, the smaller shareholders, retired employees, early investors, and local business partners who had supported Dad's growth over the years still controlled their shares independently. Many of these people were elderly or had moved away from the area, making them willing to sell their holdings for reasonable prices, especially given the negative publicity surrounding the company's recent turmoil. I began reaching out to these shareholders through carefully crafted letters from my shell companies, offering to purchase their Sullivan Industries stock at premium prices. The letters emphasized our commitment to preserving manufacturing jobs in the local community while providing shareholders with immediate cash returns on investments they might prefer to liquidate. The first major breakthrough came from Eleanor Watson, Dad's former secretary who had retired 5 years earlier with a gift of 200 shares as recognition for her 20 years of service. Eleanor remembered me fondly from my childhood visits to the office and was happy to sell her shares to what she believed was an investment company committed to protecting Dad's legacy. "Your father was such a good man," she told me during our phone conversation, not recognizing my voice after months of stress and careful vocal coaching. "I hope whoever buys these shares will honor what he built." Word of premium stock purchase offers spread through the network of former employees and early investors, creating a steady stream of sellers who were eager to convert their holdings into immediate cash. Within 6 weeks, my shell companies had acquired an additional 15% ownership, bringing my total holdings to 85% of outstanding shares. But the most unexpected development came during week 7 of my acquisition campaign. Harold Cooper called my apartment late one evening, his voice shaking with what sounded like genuine terror. "Kristen, I know you have every reason to hate me, but I need to see you immediately. It's about your father and what really happened at the board meeting." We met at a 24-hour diner on the highway outside town, a location Harold chose because it minimized the chances of being seen by anyone connected to Sullivan Industries. He looked haggard and exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "They forced me to lie about you," he said immediately. tears streaming down his face. Janet Walsh discovered that my son Derek had accumulated over $100,000 in gambling debts through online poker sites. She threatened to expose him and ruin his teaching career unless I supported her plan to remove you from the company. The confession hit me like a physical blow. Harold's son, Derek, was a high school mathematics teacher with 2 young children and a wife who worked as a nurse. $100,000 in gambling debt would destroy their family financially while ending Derek's teaching career if the school district learned about his addiction. Janet showed me photographs of Derek at underground poker games, documentation of his online gambling accounts, everything needed to prove he had violated his teaching contract and probably committed fraud by accessing school funds to cover initial losses, Harold continued. She said she would make all of it disappear if I testified against you during the board meeting. He pulled out a manila envelope filled with documents, bank statements, email exchanges, and recorded phone conversations that proved Janet Walsh's blackmail scheme. Harold had been documenting their interactions secretly, hoping to eventually expose her coercion while protecting his son from immediate consequences. I voted against you to save Derek's career and his family's stability, Harold said, his voice breaking completely. But I've been gathering evidence of Janet's real activities ever since. She's been selling client information to Morrison Manufacturing for over 2 years, skimming money from vendor payments, and planning to force a sale of Sullivan Industries that would make her and Robert incredibly wealthy. The information Harold provided revealed the final pieces of their conspiracy. Janet Walsh and Uncle Robert had been planning to sell Sullivan Industries to Morrison Manufacturing for $35 million, a transaction that would make them multimillionaires while destroying the company Dad had built and eliminating 400 local manufacturing jobs. Morrison wants to buy Sullivan Industries specifically to eliminate competition and acquire our client relationships, Harold explained. They plan to shut down both facilities within 18 months and move all operations to their existing plants in Mexico and Tennessee. This wasn't just personal betrayal or simple embezzlement. This was a coordinated effort to sell out Dad's life's work and destroy hundreds of families who depended on Sullivan Industries for their livelihoods. Can you help me stop them? Harold asked desperately. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but your father was my best friend for 30 years. I can't let his company be destroyed by people who never understood what he was trying to build. I studied Harold's tearful face across the diner table, weighing his confession against months of pain and betrayal. But Dad had always believed in second chances for people who genuinely recognized their mistakes and committed to making things right. I've been buying back stock through shell companies, I told him quietly. If you help me gather intelligence about their timeline and provide testimony about the blackmail, I can stop the Morrison sale permanently. Harold's relief was visible as he realized I was offering him a path toward redemption. Over the following weeks, he fed me inside information about board meetings and Morrison negotiations, while I accelerated my stock acquisition campaign. By the time Uncle Robert and Janet Walsh realized what was happening, I had already secured 62% ownership and was rapidly approaching the 65% threshold that would give me absolute control. The war was about to begin, but this time I held all the strategic advantages. With Harold Cooper's intelligence and my growing stock ownership, I began assembling the legal and financial team necessary to wage full-scale corporate warfare against Uncle Robert and Janet Walsh. This wasn't just about reclaiming Dad's company anymore. It was about preventing the destruction of 400 jobs and exposing federal crimes that had been hidden behind family business disputes. Margaret Chen recommended additional specialists who could handle the complex securities, fraud, and corporate espionage aspects of our case. David Park, a former federal prosecutor who now specialized in white-collar criminal defense, agreed to coordinate with the FBI investigation while protecting my interests as we built toward public disclosure. Sarah Williams, a forensic accountant with experience untangling sophisticated embezzlement schemes, began analyzing Sullivan Industries' financial records to calculate the full extent of Janet's theft. Based on the patterns we're seeing, Sarah told me during our third meeting, Janet Walsh has been systematically skimming between $50,000 and $75,000 annually for at least 4 years. Combined with the money she received from Morrison Manufacturing for stolen trade secrets, she's probably obtained over $500,000 in illegal income. The scope of their crimes grew clearer as our investigation deepened. Janet had created a web of phantom vendors and inflated expense reports that funneled company funds into accounts she controlled. She had sold client lists, manufacturing specifications, and strategic planning documents to Morrison Manufacturing, giving them unfair competitive advantages that had cost Sullivan Industries millions in lost contracts. Meanwhile, my shell companies reached the crucial 65% ownership threshold through purchases from 2 final shareholders. Robert Mitchell, one of Dad's early business partners, sold his remaining 3% stake for personal reasons after his wife's medical expenses depleted their retirement savings. Linda Parker, whose late husband had been one of Dad's first employees, decided to liquidate her 2% holding to fund her grandchildren's college educations. Each transaction brought me closer to the moment when I could walk back into that boardroom with legal authority that Uncle Robert and Janet Walsh couldn't challenge or circumvent. But they weren't sitting idle while I prepared my counterattack. Harold's intelligence revealed that Uncle Robert had grown increasingly suspicious about the identity of the investment companies purchasing Sullivan Industries stock. His legal background made him naturally paranoid about unexpected changes in shareholding patterns, especially when those changes coincided with premium purchase offers that seemed too generous for normal market conditions. Robert spent yesterday afternoon making phone calls to the shell company contact numbers, Harold reported during one of our clandestine meetings at the Highway Diner. He's trying to identify the principals behind Midwest Manufacturing Holdings and Great Lakes Investment Partners. The timeline was accelerating faster than I had anticipated. Margaret Chen's carefully constructed corporate veils would eventually be penetrated if Uncle Robert hired investigators or demanded legal discovery through court proceedings. We needed to move from covert acquisition to open confrontation before they could mount effective countermeasures. The crisis came during week 10, when Harold called with urgent news. They're scheduling an emergency board meeting for Friday morning. Robert wants to fast-track the Morrison Manufacturing sale before whoever's buying stock can accumulate enough shares to block the transaction. 3 days. I had 72 hours to finalize my legal preparations, coordinate with federal investigators, and plan a confrontation that would expose their crimes while preventing the sale of Dad's company to Morrison Manufacturing. David Park worked around the clock to coordinate with the FBI agents handling Janet Walsh's case, ensuring that criminal charges would be filed simultaneously with my corporate takeover to prevent any possibility of evidence destruction or witness intimidation. Sarah Williams prepared detailed financial documentation proving the extent of Janet's embezzlement and the damage her industrial espionage had caused to company operations. I spent those final nights in my studio apartment, surrounded by legal documents and strategic plans, drawing strength from Dad's photograph and his memories of building Sullivan Industries from nothing. He had taught me that successful business required both strategic thinking and moral courage, the willingness to fight for principles, even when fighting seemed hopeless. Your father believed in justice and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, Margaret Chen reminded me during our final strategy session. 400 families are depending on you to save their jobs and prevent Morrison from destroying this company. You're not just reclaiming your inheritance, you're preserving your father's legacy and protecting your community. The transformation felt complete as I prepared for Friday's confrontation. 6 months earlier, I had been a grieving daughter who trusted family members to guide me through business decisions. Now I was a strategic corporate leader with majority ownership, federal law enforcement support, and detailed evidence of the crimes committed against Dad's company. Harold provided the final piece of intelligence Thursday evening. Janet Walsh had been behaving erratically during recent meetings, drinking heavily at lunch and making careless statements about her financial situation. The FBI investigation pressure was taking its toll on her psychological stability, creating opportunities for mistakes that would expose her guilt more clearly. She's been bragging to other employees about her vacation home and expensive jewelry, Harold reported. People are starting to ask questions about how a CFO can afford a lifestyle that costs more than her salary. Everything was aligned for Friday morning's showdown. I had majority ownership, federal investigators ready to act, comprehensive evidence of their crimes, and detailed plans for saving Sullivan Industries from Morrison Manufacturing's acquisition attempt. The war I had been preparing for months was finally beginning. But this time I held all the strategic advantages while Uncle Robert and Janet Walsh remained overconfident about their control over the situation. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear as I walked through the main entrance of Sullivan Industries for the first time since my humiliating removal 6 months earlier. Employees in the lobby did double takes, whispering among themselves about why the supposedly disgraced former VP was returning to the building. Some faces showed curiosity, others displayed sympathy, and a few offered barely perceptible nods of support. My heels clicked confidently against the marble floor as I made my way toward the executive conference room where the board meeting was scheduled. I carried a leather briefcase containing legal documentation of my majority ownership, evidence of Janet Walsh's crimes, and Harold Cooper's sworn affidavit about the blackmail scheme that had forced his testimony against me. The mahogany doors stood closed as I approached, but I could hear Uncle Robert's voice through the wood, speaking authoritatively about expediting the Morrison Manufacturing sale process. Without knocking, I turned the handle and walked directly into the room. The conversation stopped immediately. Uncle Robert's face went white as he saw me standing in the doorway. Janet Walsh dropped her coffee cup, sending hot liquid splashing across financial documents spread on the table. Harold Cooper maintained his composure, but I caught the slight nod he gave me as our eyes met. "What are you doing here?" Uncle Robert demanded, rising from his chair with obvious anger. "This is a private board meeting, and you have no authority to attend." I moved calmly to the head of the table, setting my briefcase down in the spot Dad had always occupied during board meetings. "Actually, Uncle Robert, I have every authority to attend this meeting. In fact, I have authority to control this meeting." Opening my briefcase with deliberate precision, I removed the legal documentation Margaret Chen had prepared, proving my majority ownership through the shell company acquisitions. These documents establish that I currently own 65% of Sullivan Industries' outstanding shares, making me the majority shareholder with full voting control. Uncle Robert's face flushed red as he grabbed the documents, scanning them frantically while Janet Walsh looked over his shoulder with growing panic. "This is impossible. These shell companies, who's behind these purchases?" "I am," I said simply, taking my seat at the head of the table. "While you were celebrating my removal and planning to sell Dad's company to Morrison Manufacturing, I was systematically buying back control from shareholders who deserved better treatment than what you've provided." Janet Walsh found her voice, though it shook noticeably. "Those purchases were illegal. You can't secretly acquire controlling interest without disclosure requirements. We'll challenge this in court and prove you violated securities regulations." I smiled calmly at her accusations. Every purchase was conducted through properly licensed investment companies with full legal compliance overseen by securities attorneys. "But since you mentioned illegal activities, Janet, perhaps we should discuss your embezzlement of company funds and your sale of trade secrets to Morrison Manufacturing." The color drained from Janet's face as I began laying out photographs of her meetings with Morrison executives, bank records showing unexplained deposits to her accounts, and documentation of the forged expense reports she had used to frame me for financial misconduct. "These photographs show you meeting with Morrison Manufacturing's acquisition team on 7 separate occasions over the past year," I continued, placing each image on the table methodically. "These bank records show deposits totaling over $200,000 that coincide with major contract losses to Morrison. And these are the forensic analysis results proving that my signatures on those expense reports were expertly forged." Harold Cooper cleared his throat nervously. "Kristen, there's something I need to say publicly." He pulled out his own manila envelope, removing documents that detailed Janet's blackmail scheme. "Janet Walsh threatened to destroy my son's teaching career unless I testified falsely against you during the removal proceedings. She had discovered Derek's gambling problems and used them to force my cooperation." Uncle Robert stared at Harold in shock. You were blackmailed into lying about Kristen's performance? Janet showed me evidence that Derek had accumulated substantial gambling debts through online poker sites. Harold admitted, his voice heavy with shame. She threatened to expose him to his school district and ruin our family, unless I supported her narrative about Kristen's incompetence and erratic behavior. As if summoned by our conversation, 3 FBI agents appeared at the conference room door with badges prominently displayed. Special Agent Maria Santos stepped forward with official documents. Janet Walsh, you're under arrest for violations of federal wire fraud statutes, theft of trade secrets, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. Janet's facade of composure cracked completely. This is harassment. These accusations are fabricated by a disgruntled former employee who's trying to blame others for her own failures. But as Agent Santos began reading her rights, Janet's psychological defenses collapsed entirely. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Robert and Morrison executives demanded faster results, and Thomas never appreciated my contributions to this company. I built those financial systems. I maintained those client relationships. And I deserved compensation that reflected my real value. Her confession spilled out in a torrent of self-justification and blame-shifting. Morrison offered me a consulting position worth 3 times my salary here. But they needed insider information to complete their acquisition strategy. Robert knew about the arrangement and encouraged me to provide whatever assistance Morrison required. Uncle Robert stood up frantically, denying Janet's accusations. I never authorized industrial espionage or theft of company secrets. You told me Morrison was offering a legitimate acquisition proposal that would benefit all shareholders. You knew exactly what I was providing them. Janet screamed, pointing an accusing finger across the table. Client lists, manufacturing specifications, strategic plans, everything Morrison needed to undermine our contracts and position themselves as the only viable buyer for Sullivan Industries. Agent Santos gestured for her partners to begin Janet's arrest, while additional FBI personnel secured the conference room as a crime scene. Janet continued her breakdown as handcuffs clicked into place, revealing additional crimes including tax evasion, money laundering through offshore accounts, and bribery of municipal officials who had fast-tracked permits for Morrison Manufacturing's expansion plans. She convinced me that Morrison's acquisition offer represented the best outcome for protecting jobs and maintaining operations, Uncle Robert said desperately, trying to distance himself from Janet's criminal activities. I never imagined she was stealing company secrets or embezzling funds. Harold Cooper handed me his official resignation letter. Kristen, I know I can never fully make up for what I did to you and your father's memory, but I'm prepared to testify about everything Janet told me and everything I witnessed during those meetings. As FBI agents escorted Janet Walsh from the building in handcuffs, I turned to Uncle Robert with a calm authority I had never felt before. Your resignation is also required. Effective immediately, the Morrison Manufacturing sale is permanently canceled, and Sullivan Industries will remain an independent company focused on Dad's original vision. The remaining board members sat in stunned silence as the scope of Janet's betrayal became clear. This hadn't been simple family business disagreement or management transition difficulties. It had been systematic criminal conspiracy designed to steal Dad's life work while destroying my reputation in the process. Harold, your resignation is accepted, but I'm offering you the opportunity to remain with the company as a senior advisor while you help rebuild the client relationships that Janet's actions damaged, I announced. Your son Derek will receive treatment support for his gambling addiction, and this family's financial problems will remain private matters. Uncle Robert gathered his papers with obvious defeat. I genuinely believed I was protecting the company and honoring your father's memory. I let Janet convince me that you weren't ready for leadership responsibility. Dad taught me that leadership means protecting people who can't protect themselves, I replied. Janet Walsh almost destroyed 400 jobs and sold out our community to corporate interests that don't care about anything except profit margins. That's not the legacy Dad wanted to leave. As Uncle Robert left the conference room for the final time, I sat alone at the head of the table where Dad had built his company through 30 years of honest work and community commitment. The war was over, and justice had been served, But the real work of rebuilding and honoring Dad's legacy was just beginning. 3 months later, I stood in Dad's former office, now my office, watching morning sunlight stream through windows that overlooked the production floor, where 400 employees were building automotive components with renewed pride and security. Janet Walsh had been sentenced to 6 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to wire fraud, theft of trade secrets, and conspiracy charges. Morrison Manufacturing faced their own federal investigation for corporate espionage, and their acquisition plans had been permanently shelved. Uncle Robert had quietly left town rather than face civil lawsuits for his role in the conspiracy, though I chose not to pursue criminal charges given his cooperation with federal investigators. Some betrayals run too deep for forgiveness. But Dad had taught me that vengeance was less important than building something positive from whatever remained after destruction. The company transformation began immediately with complete financial transparency and employee profit-sharing programs that Dad had always planned to implement. I held town halls where workers could ask direct questions about company operations, job security, and future expansion plans. The culture of fear and secrecy that had developed during Janet's tenure was replaced with open communication and collaborative decision-making. Harold Cooper's redemption became one of the most satisfying aspects of rebuilding Sullivan Industries. His detailed knowledge of client relationships and genuine remorse for his betrayal made him invaluable in restoring contracts that Morrison Manufacturing had attempted to steal through Janet's espionage. Harold's son Derek entered gambling addiction treatment, and their family slowly healed from the financial and emotional trauma Janet had exploited. "Your father would be proud of the leader you've become," Harold told me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. He always said that real character emerges during the most difficult challenges, and you've proven him right. The financial recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. Insurance claims related to Janet's embezzlement returned over $400,000 to company accounts. New contracts with automotive manufacturers who appreciated our renewed focus on quality and reliability brought monthly revenue to record levels. Employee morale surveys showed the highest satisfaction ratings in company history. More importantly, Sullivan Industries began expanding our community involvement in ways that honored Dad's memory while creating positive local economic impact. We established the Thomas Sullivan Manufacturing Scholarship for local students pursuing engineering and business degrees. We partnered with the community college to develop apprenticeship programs that provided career pathways for young people who wanted to enter manufacturing without accumulating college debt. My personal transformation felt equally dramatic. The grieving daughter who had trusted family members to guide her through business decisions had evolved into a confident leader who understood that protecting people sometimes requires fighting battles that seem impossible to win. I had learned to read financial statements like strategic intelligence, to navigate legal complexities with precision, and to make difficult decisions that balanced compassion with business necessity. The former friends who had abandoned me during the scandal gradually returned with apologies and explanations about their initial reactions to the negative publicity. Some relationships could be rebuilt, while others had been damaged too severely by their failure to support me during my darkest period. Dad had taught me that loyalty revealed itself during crisis, not during comfortable times. Professional recognition followed as business journals featured Sullivan Industries as a case study in family business recovery and employee-focused management strategies. I received invitations to speak at conferences about corporate governance and crisis leadership, though I preferred focusing on daily operations rather than becoming a public figure. The most meaningful moment came during our annual company picnic, when employees presented me with a plaque reading "Leadership Through Adversity," in honor of Thomas Sullivan's legacy. Eleanor Watson, Dad's former secretary who had unknowingly sold me stock that helped secure majority ownership, spoke about how proud Dad would be to see his daughter protecting the company and community he loved. Sitting in Dad's office that evening, I studied his photograph and reflected on the journey from desperate grief to strategic victory. The company he built in his garage had not only survived attempted destruction but had emerged stronger and more committed to the values he considered most important. The real lesson wasn't about corporate warfare or stock acquisitions or FBI investigations. It was about the responsibility that comes with protecting something bigger than personal interests. 400 families depended on Sullivan Industries for their livelihoods. Our community relied on the jobs and economic stability we provided. Dad's legacy lived through every honest business decision and every commitment to treating people with dignity and respect. Janet Walsh had taught me that betrayal often comes from unexpected sources, but Harold Cooper had shown me that redemption was possible for people who genuinely recognized their mistakes and committed to making amends. Uncle Robert's departure reminded me that some relationships couldn't survive fundamental disagreements about ethics and responsibility. Looking ahead, Sullivan Industries faced exciting opportunities for expansion while maintaining our commitment to American manufacturing and community investment. We were developing partnerships with electric vehicle manufacturers who valued our precision engineering capabilities. We were exploring automation technologies that could improve efficiency while creating higher-skilled positions for our workforce. The future felt limitless because it was built on solid foundations of financial transparency, employee respect, and community commitment that couldn't be destroyed by personal ambition or corporate greed. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I noticed Dad's coffee mug still sitting on the bookshelf where I'd placed it months earlier. "Future CEO," it read. And I smiled at his confidence in my abilities long before I had developed confidence in myself. He had been right about everything that mattered. Real leadership meant protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, fighting for principles even when victory seemed impossible, and building something lasting that would benefit generations beyond our own lifetimes. The war was over, justice had been served, and Dad's legacy was secure in hands that understood its true value. Have you ever faced a situation where someone you trusted completely betrayed you? How did you find the strength to fight back and rebuild what they tried to destroy? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need inspiration to stand up for themselves. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and finding justice when everything seems hopeless. Thank you for taking this journey with me. And remember, sometimes the greatest victories come from the battles we never expected to fight.